Welcome everyone to the 8th installment of the A&A Legacy series, in which we get acquainted with the legends, heroes, and icons of the numismatic hobby. I'm your host, Barbara Gregory, Editor-in-Chief of the Numismatist magazine. This evening, we are delighted to welcome a very special guest, professional numismatist and avid collector, Mark Borckardt.
Well, thank you, Barbara. I'm delighted to be here and certainly pleased to have all of you in the audience as well.
And I just want to give you a little bit of background about Mark. Mark was born in St. Paul, Minnesota in 1957 to Jack and Margaret Borckardt. When he was 4, his family moved to Ann Arbor, Michigan, where they resided until 1965. Ultimately, they settled in Finley, Ohio, where Mark lived and worked until age 32. When Mark was a teenager in the early 1970s, he and his father began attending coin shows as vest pocket dealers, operating under the name Fort Finley Coins and later as Collector's Cabinet. In 1983, the two set up a brick and mortar shop in Finley, which they operated until 1989, when fire destroyed the retail center where the store was located. Not long after, Mark joined the staff of Bowers and Morena Galleries in Wolfboro, New Hampshire, where he was employed for 14 years. And today he is senior numismatist and cataloger for Heritage Auctions in Dallas. Welcome, Mark. We are so pleased to have you here this evening.
Thank you, Barbara.
Well, Mark, tell us about your parents and your upbringing. What brought your family to St. Paul, Ann Arbor, and finally Finley?
Well, my dad was born in Cleveland, Ohio in 1925, and he, as still a 17-year-old in high school, he enlisted in the Coast Guard during World War II, where he was serving in the South Pacific. And he later recounted that the only action he actually saw was when he was in the hospital for appendicitis surgery during the war. After the war, he went to the College of Worcester, where he graduated in 1950, and then continued his education in Chicago, Illinois. I think it was about 2.5 years ago, Heritage Auctions was privileged to handle a collection of the Reverend Dr. James McClure, who is from Chicago. It was a phenomenal collection that McClure began assembling in about 1860 and continued until his death in 1932. The collection remained with the heirs until 2016, when they called in Greg Rohan, Jim Stouchesteik, and myself. The three of us were in the bank meeting with the family, and as we were going through all the work with the collection, doing all the inventory and all the paperwork, they were telling us something about the Reverend Dr. McClure. And one of the things they mentioned was that for several years he was president of McCormick Theological Seminary in Chicago. And as soon as they said that, I looked up. I was a little bit surprised. And I said, my dad graduated from McCormick Theological Seminary. So that was sort of a small world connection that is one of several small world connections that I've had in numismatics. My dad went on to be a Presbyterian minister for many years. And several years ago, I was talking with the late Jay Johnson, former mint director. And during the conversation, I learned that he was from Bessemer, Michigan. Bessemer is in the Upper Peninsula, about 5 miles from the Wisconsin border. And he told me that he grew up there in the 1950s. So I asked him where he went to church. And he told me that he went to the small Presbyterian church in Bessemer. So then I asked him if he remembered my dad, who was the minister at the Presbyterian church in Bessemer. And he apologized, he didn't remember. My mom was born in Ohio in 1924. A few years before she was born, there was a mint director at the U.S. Mint, Frank Scobie. He served 18 months from 1922 to 1923. Frank Scobie was born and raised in Troy, Ohio. He left his position as the mint director 11 months before my mom was born in Troy, Ohio. So that's another small world connection. And then there's Colonel James Finley, who was the originator of Finley, Ohio, my hometown. He established Fort Finley during the War of 1812. Well, he was originally from Pennsylvania, and he was the brother of William Finley, who was governor of Pennsylvania for quite a period of time. But for 14 years, William Finley was treasurer of the U.S. Mint. So I have all these small world connections in numismatics that they were there just because I looked, and I would have never expected. But growing up, my dad was a Presbyterian minister for many years, and then he went on to accept a position at Finley College where he was a speech professor. And so Finley was my hometown. We moved there in 1965, and I was there until 1989. It still to this day is the single longest place that I've lived of anywhere in the country. So I do consider Finley my hometown, and I hope you all have a chance. I brought some items in the two display cases from my personal Finley, Ohio collection, which has some Civil War tokens, some national currency, and various other items. There's a notebook sitting on top of the case there that you're all welcome to look at while you're here. And that's a few samples of my postcard collection of Finley, Ohio postcards. I brought along about 80 postcards. I actually have over 600.
Well, it sounds like that your childhood in Finley sounds almost idyllic. But tell me a little bit about what you were like as a child. Do you recall any defining moments in your early years?
Well, if we count being a child up until I turned 18, yes. There was a defining moment. My childhood, I would describe myself as a very shy child. I still am to a certain extent. Shy, not a child, although that's debatable. You know, back in the 60s as a child, we didn't have computers, we didn't have video games, we didn't have cell phones or any of that. As some of you are aware, others are a little younger and maybe not aware of that. So we had to go out and play with our friends, and we would ride our bikes and go to the park, and pretty much a typical 1960s childhood. The defining moment was when I was 17 years old. I had an older brother, James, who was 18, and he passed away in 1974 at the age of 18. So that was a very difficult time. He was a heavy asthmatic, and he literally choked on mucus in his sleep. And he passed away Christmas Day in 1974. So that was a tough time. And I would say that was probably certainly a defining time.
Mm-hmm. Well, what first attracted you to numismatics?
1963. I believe it was 1963. We were at one of the churches where my dad was serving, and one of the church members gave my brother and I a 1964 Red Book. And they always come out a year ahead, so I assume that was 1963. I don't know exactly. But I was fascinated. I was looking at the Red Book, and I thought, this is really neat. You know, I learned about things like a $3 gold piece, and half cents, and commemorative coins. And it captured my interest. And at a very young age. From there, the interest kind of waned a little bit for a few years, but then in junior high school, I started attending my junior high school coin club meetings. And then I started attending my local Finley, Ohio coin club, Blanchard Valley Coin Club. And then at one point, I asked my dad to take me to a coin show. And he looked at me and said, "A coin what?" And I said, "A coin show." So I'd explained to him what a coin show was. And he was a college professor. He was making maybe $8,000 or $10,000 a year at that time in the late, it was about 1970. But he took me to a coin show. And I had a good time. I don't know if he did, but he took me to another one. At the second coin show we went to, my dad spent $200 and bought a 1955 double die penny. Now, when you're making $8,000 or $10,000 a year, $200 is a lot of money. And we got home, and he was all excited, and I was all excited, and he showed my mom, and I can still hear her yelling and screaming. How are we going to feed the kids? How are we going to pay the bills? It just went on and on. And so we went to another coin show. My dad sold the coin for $250. We got home. He gave my mom the $250. He said, feed the kids with the $200, and you can spend the $50 profit on whatever you want. And at that moment, my dad and I were coin dealers, and my mom never said another word.
Well, obviously your dad followed your lead as far as your interest in numismatics, and you attended coin shows together. And you began, as I mentioned earlier, you started to become vest pocket dealers when you went to these shows. Is that more or less correct?
Vest pocket dealers, and also we took tables at small local coin shows. I do want to mention another person, probably my first mentor, if you will, in numismatics, a fellow by the name of Roger Zorn from Finley, who I've not been in touch with recently. But at the time I started going to the local coin club meetings, he was president of the club. And he also traveled to shows in the early 70s, and he and my dad and I, the three of us, would often travel to shows together and set up together and almost operate as a partnership for a few years.
It sounds like this whole partnership came about gradually. Did it indeed? I would
say that's a fair statement.
So, what were some of the important lessons you learned on the road and in your coin shop, and how did they impact your life and your hobby?
I think the most important lessons, especially into the 1980s, I was married. My first son was born in 1983, and when you have to rely on your abilities as a coin dealer, a coin trader, to feed the family, you're either going to learn really fast what you're doing, or you're going to find something else to do. So those were the days that, I studied numismatics as much as I could. I learned to grade coins. I learned about buying and selling coins. I learned about detecting counterfeits, and just developed those skills over a period of time.
Mm-hmm. Well, while you were getting acquainted with all the ins and outs of the numismatic trade, you also worked at Timber Lanes as a bowling alley mechanic and a clerk. Tell us a little bit about that experience.
I started an interest in bowling right around 1971 or 72, and fell in love with the sport. And then I was often going out to the local bowling center, Timber Lanes, which is no longer there, but at the time I would go there and practice my bowling, and eventually became acquainted with the co-owners, Bob and Gladys Winkle, who were very dear friends of mine. They've since passed away, but I think of them all the time. They have two daughters that I'm very close with. But I just enjoyed the sport, and so eventually they hired me to work behind the machines, which was quite an experience, and then at the counter. And we would, a group of us would bowl what are called pot games. And basically, for those of you that are not acquainted, pot games, you'd all put a certain amount of money in a pot, and whoever had the high score would take the money. And so I think I was making $2 an hour at the bowling center at the time, and bowling for $5 a game. And that's when you learn to bowl, or you stop bowling. And so that was a time where I really enjoyed the sport. I enjoyed working at the bowling center, and I worked there on a part-time basis for a number of years.
I mentioned that fire destroyed the shop. Was it 1989 or 1988?
August 21st, 1988.
88. So I was mistaken.
2:45 in the morning, if you want to know for sure.
So tell us a little bit about how the fire started, and also it seems that you were able to move on after the fire, but how did it affect your father, whom you've described as your mentor and your best friend?
Well, first of all, if you look in the display case over there, there is actually a picture of the fire with our coin store burning down to the ground. The fire started in the laundromat next door to our coin shop. It was an electrical fire. At the time, the building codes said that a firewall between businesses should go up to the ceiling. Now, I think today it has to go up to the roof line, but at that time it only went up to the ceiling of the stores. And so this fire spread out throughout the entire little shopping plaza in the rafters for as near as they could determine, maybe 2 hours before anybody even noticed it. We were right across the street from the fire department at the time, literally across the street, and they had no idea. And so I finally got the call about little after 4 in the morning, your shop's on fire, you need to go out there, and I did. And it was pretty much gone. It was a 90% loss according to the fire marshal, which was very difficult because that meant the insurance companies would come in and they adjusted everything. My dad and I had just bought a fairly substantial numismatic library for 5 figures. And it was in the shop, and it went up in smoke. And the insurance adjuster said, well, used books are worth 50 cents each. And so basically, the effect on my dad was financial disaster, from which he really never recovered. So it was a difficult time, probably I would say the worst day in my numismatic life. You graduated from Finley College, now Finley University, in 1986 with a degree in mathematics. At that time, what were your plans for the future? Well, actually, technically I did graduate in 1986, although I had completed all but 12 semester hours of my coursework from 1976 through 1980. In 1980, it was May, I believe, there was a gentleman who I knew quite well who I saw him at a convention, and I said, do you know of anybody that needs numismatic help? And he said, yeah, me. So I left college 12 hours short of graduation and took my first job away from Finley and my dad. The gentleman was from Pittsburgh. Steve, you're acquainted with Dave Berg, I believe. So Dave Berg was my first numismatic employer, and I left college to take that job, so I finally finished the last 12 hours in 1986.
Good for you. Well, how did the job offers from Bowers and Morena galleries and heritage auctions alter the course of your life? And what experiences have you taken away from your careers there?
Well, after the fire and we lost the store, it was not long after that Bowers and Morena ran a help wanted ad. And so I sent a resume. And in response to my resume, Ray Morena sent me a coin quiz. Now, Dave Bowers was big on coin quizzes. It was multiple choice. He used to run them in his Rare Coin Review. So Ray sends me this 60-question coin quiz. And he says, please answer this coin quiz without using any references. We'd like to assess your knowledge. So I did. And I sent it back. And he said, you're the first person that's ever had a perfect score. And so he called me in for the first interview. And apparently he wanted to make sure I didn't cheat on this coin quiz. So as soon as I got to the offices in Wolfboro, he sat me down in the conference room without a book in sight and gave me another 60-question coin quiz. And I passed that one as well. He actually said I missed one answer, but I later discussed it with him, and he actually had the wrong answer on his answer key. Bowers and Morena, I would say, was my training ground, if you will, for my present position with Heritage. I think that's fair to say. I learned a lot from Dave Bowers. I learned a lot from my colleagues at Bowers and Maruna. They were wonderful numismatists, and I handled some amazing coins. Then in 2004, things kind of changed at Bowers. Well, they had been changing for several years at that point. And I found myself with the option of either having to move my family to Southern California or being unemployed. So I chose unemployed. The next day I was at the offices of Heritage, and they hired me. And I have to say now, as a cataloger for Heritage, I work with probably what I consider to be the best numismatic staff in the business. And they're all here in the audience. Thanks for coming out. These fellows that I work with are phenomenal.
Well, Mark, you've handled some of the greatest coins in U.S. numismatics, including the 1913 Liberty Head nickels. Tell us about your experience with the fifth example, thought missing for decades, and when it was rediscovered.
How much time do we have?
As much time as you'd like.
Well, I'll mention a few other things first. I was at Bowers and Maruna when the first $1 million coin crossed the auction block in 1996, and that was a 1913 nickel, the Eliasberg example, sold for just under $1.5 million. Since that time, there have been 95 American coins that have crossed the $1 million mark in auction. And Heritage has handled 53 of those. And I have cataloged 27 of those 53. So I've had the opportunity to personally work with absolutely amazing coins. I think I was there about 6 months, maybe less, when I came into the office, and I was handed 2 brazier doubloons to catalog, which from my coin shop days in Finley, Ohio, I would have never dreamed that I was going to be cataloging 2 brazier doubloons. I have been really fortunate over many years, especially at Heritage, but at Bowers before that as well. Jeff Garrett, your 100 Greatest U.S. Coins book, I have personally cataloged or handled 89 of the 100 greatest U.S. coins.
You got some work to do then.
I do.
Getting the 1849 $20 gold pieces.
The few that I haven't are unique pieces in the Smithsonian and a couple others. But I've been very fortunate.
We'll still accept those for consignment.
Oh, absolutely. No doubt about that. The 1913 nickel episode was unbelievable. It started out in, I think it was January 2003. And Laura Sperber had the Hawaii 5.0 specimen and said she was going to display it at the ANA convention that summer. And then there was a discussion, and Don Perlman was involved, and Beth Deischer and several others. And Don said, well, I'm pretty sure I can get Dwight to bring the Eliasberg specimen as well, so we could have 2 of them there. And immediately the ANA said, well, we can bring ours, we can have 3 of them there. And then somebody said, well, why don't we get the Smithsonian's and we can have all 4 of them there? Well, the Smithsonian was more of a challenge. But there's a fellow that works at the ANA today who worked at the Smithsonian at that time. His name is Doug Mudd. And he agreed to go through all of the red tape with the Smithsonian to get their specimen out for the convention in 2003. Well, then the idea was, well, what about the 5th nickel? It's been missing since 1962. And I believe David Hall offered to make a $1 million reward offer to find the missing nickel. The whole idea of the reward offer was to promote the ANA convention that year. We never expected to find the nickel. So Paul Montgomery was up in New Hampshire at our office. We were in the process of moving our offices to Louisiana while all this was taking place. And Paul said to me right at the beginning of Memorial Day weekend, as he was about to fly back to Louisiana where he lived, he said, if you get a couple phone calls from the press, we're going to be announcing the $1 million reward offer for the 1913 nickel. And I said, what? So he told me about it because I hadn't heard anything. And he told me about this offer, and I said, it'll never work. And he said, what do you mean it'll never work? Of course it'll work. Now, he was thinking promote the A&A convention. I was thinking find the 1913 nickel. I said, it's never going to work. I was wrong. We get in contact with Ryan Gibbons and Cheryl Myers, who were niece and nephew of George Walton. And they said they had the 1913 nickel that Stax had called fake back in '63. They had it in their closet. And so after a lot of discussion back and forth, they agreed to bring it to the convention on Tuesday at the beginning of the A&A so we could look at it. And so Paul Montgomery, John Danruther, and myself, along with Don Perlman and Beth Deischer, all met with Ryan and Cheryl's husband Gary was along. We met in the A&A show office on Tuesday, and they handed us the coin. Now, John Danruther had brought with him 7 altered date 1913 nickels that he had in his collection. He thought, well, we'll just take a quick look at it as a courtesy, then I'll show them my 7 altered dates, and that'll be that. Well, his never left his pocket, because we all looked at it. I had seen the Eliasberg example and worked with that, so I knew kind of what a genuine 1913 nickel was supposed to look like. And I took a look at it, and I immediately thought to myself, this thing's real. And JD looked at it, and he said, he thought to himself, this thing's real. And Paul looked at it, same response. So we told the family we were 98% sure that it was the genuine missing 5th nickel. But we wanted to be 100% sure, of course. And we had the other 4 in Baltimore for the convention, but they were out at another event that Tuesday evening. So we had to wait until midnight. We had a midnight authentication meeting, which seemed appropriate because everybody had said that it was the midnight minters that made the 1913 nickels. So that all made sense. So the authentication team, Paul and myself, Jeff Garrett, Fred Weinberg, John Danruther, and David Hall. So the 6 of us were at a table. Right behind us were these 2 larger-than-life guards from the Smithsonian that were in charge of not losing their specimen. And we were like little kids in a candy store. We were passing these 5 nickels back and forth between the 6 of us for 45 minutes. I think, Jeff, would it take us maybe a minute or 2 to determine it was real? And the rest of the time was just we were having fun. And this is the first time the 5 1913 nickels had been together since the mid-1940s when Eric Newman dispersed of them. So it was an event that certainly the highlight of my career. There's no question about it.
3 years ago, Mark, in a profile for the Numismatist, you said that as a collector, you are more concerned with condition than grade. Can you explain what you meant? And has your opinion changed since that time?
I can certainly explain what I meant, and my opinion has not changed. Over my years in the business, I have worked with countless collections. And the typical theme is problem-free coins bring all the money. Coins with problems bring very little money in comparison. So what I mean basically is be quality conscious, not quantity conscious. I'd much rather see you buy a coin that, let's say, it grades very fine or extremely fine, that's absolutely problem-free, rather than buying a cleaned mint state coin or a coin that has problems. And that's all it is. It's choose quality over quantity.
You mentioned earlier that you have a great many interests outside of numismatics, and one is Deltology, the collecting of postcards. How did you become interested in that field, and what are among your greatest finds or your favorites? You brought a number of them here.
I brought a number of my Finley postcards with me. Shortly after I joined Bowers & Moreno, it was early 90s, Dave Bowers had a big box of postcards. And he asked me if I would go through them and sort them out, because he knew there were a lot of them that were related to numismatics, and there were others that had nothing to do with numismatics. And he wanted me to go through and sort them out and pull out the ones that were related to numismatics. So I said sure, but it wasn't something I could do in the office. So I took the box home with me over a weekend, and I went through it. And I pulled out a whole stack of numismatic-related postcards, national banks, mint photos, so on and so forth. And I brought them back to the office on Monday, and I said, Dave, these are really cool. And he said, well, are there some you like? And I said, yeah. And I pulled out a stack of maybe 20 or so cards that he gave to me. And one of my favorites that he gave to me was actually a U.S. Treasury postcard printed on macerated money, which is really, really cool. So since that time, I started going to antique malls on the weekends and postcard shops and postcard shows. And the net result is that I have over 600 Finley, Ohio postcards. And I have over 1,200 numismatic-related postcards. I did bring some of my Finley cards. I didn't bring any of the numismatic postcards because they are now all in St. Louis being scanned for the Newman portal. So you'll all eventually be able to see the entire 1,200 card collection on the portal.
And you've already told us a good deal about some of the material you brought from Finley. What pieces hold the most significance for you from your Finley collection?
In the case over there, there's a couple Civil War tokens. Finley, Ohio Civil War tokens are actually very rare. The most common variety is listed as rarity 7. So I have 2 of those. I have one more that I didn't bring with me, but all 3 of them are from the Osborne and Company grocers. There are, I think, 4 merchants from Finley that issued Civil War tokens. The Osborne grocer tokens are the most common, and the others I've only seen a couple of ever, so I don't have those. So those are certainly prized items. I have a Finley National, a brownback Finley National in the case over there that I really appreciate. So those items are a couple of my favorites from the items I brought with me.
Another hobby you enjoy is genealogy, and I understand you've traced your ancestors back to 17th century New York and New Jersey. Can you tell us a little bit about your family's Revolutionary War connections?
I have 4 ancestors, direct ancestors, that were in the Revolutionary War. There was Christopher Hite, my 5 times great-grandfather, who joined the Continental Army in 1776. He was a Valley Forge survivor. He served throughout the war. He saw action in many different battles. He was a private throughout his entire Revolutionary War history. And he actually witnessed the surrender at Yorktown. So he saw a great deal. There were 5 times great-grandfathers, Jacob Saunders and George Holstein, who were both members of the Lancaster County Militia in Pennsylvania. Jacob's son Theodore married George's daughter, and the 2 of them were my 4 times great-grandparents. There was my 6 times great-grandfather Hugh McCrary, who provided service to the Army in North Carolina. And probably my favorite of my ancestors was Captain Benjamin Merrill. He was actually a pre-revolutionary American patriot who led a group of North Carolina farmers that called themselves the Regulators. And they opposed the unfair taxation of Governor Tryon from the English governor of North Carolina. So this culminated in a small skirmish called the Battle of Alamance in North Carolina in May 1771. And Benjamin Merrill was one of 6 leaders of the Regulators who was hung for treason against the British Crown in 1771. So he was certainly a true American patriot. But going back, I'm working on, there's one connection that I haven't been able to prove. And if I can prove that, then that immediately traces my ancestry literally back to medieval England. And actually, if I can prove that, then I can prove that I'm a descendant of the early kings of England, which I think would be pretty cool. I don't know. I think that means I'm like 3 millionth to the British Crown, something like that. I don't know.
Well, going from talks of monarchy to bowling, how do you like that segue? I'd like to know a little bit more about your passion for bowling. Many people don't realize that you're a very accomplished bowler with 10 300 games under your belt.
I've been fortunate. I have had 10 300 games in league or tournament competition over the years. My first one was in New Hampshire in 1993, and that was an interesting day. I was actually bowling in the local association tournament with the singles event, and I started out with a miserable 178 game, and then had a 258 the second game, and 300 the third game, and won the tournament. And since then, as you say, I've had a total of 10 300 games. For those, I don't know if any of you are actually bowlers. I know one person is for sure, John. What I'm actually more proud of, a 3-game series that's very high is more important than the 300 game. So one night I started out with a 269 game, then I had a 299 game the second game, and a 298 the third game, and that was a total of 866 for a 3-game series, which is almost as good as it gets. So that was pretty exciting. I've been bowling league since 1972.
And do you still bowl league?
Only 3 times a week.
Only 3 times a week.
I thoroughly enjoy it. My best game this week was only 278.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So it was a struggle. But I've also served for, although I recently resigned from the board of directors, I had served many years, not only in New Hampshire, but also in Dallas. I've served on the board of directors of the local bowling associations. So that's been a real honor.
Great. Mark, you've been married to your wife, Mary Martha, for 37 years. Your son is named Matthew, and your twin daughters are Michelle and Melissa. I see a trend here.
Don't forget Molly the dog.
Oh. Were you hoping to simplify the family's monogram?
Well, actually, this is like one of the big mistakes of my life. All 5 of us have the same first and last initial. Fortunately, a few of us have different middle initials. But who opens the mail when it's addressed to M. Borckardt? I don't know. It was just, something that we thought would be kind of cute. I guess it was, but I'm not sure I would do that again. I wouldn't recommend having the same initials for all the family members, but that's what we did. There was also something interesting. It's actually kind of unusual if you think about it. All 5 of us were born on a Sunday.
Really?
Which is kind of strange. Now, of course, the twins, I mean, they were born the same day, obviously.
Right. Well, we know that an interest in numismatics isn't necessarily genetic, although it certainly can be environmental. Have any of your children expressed an interest in the hobby?
No.
Do they have an appreciation of or respect for what you do?
No.
Well, Mark, what do you consider the secret of your success? Would you say it's luck, skill, destiny, a combination of all three?
Well, certainly skill. And skill was developed over many, many years. Luck. If any of you have seen me in a casino, you would know that luck was not part of the equation. Destiny, perhaps. If we hadn't had the fire at the coin store back in 1988, I probably would have never responded to the Bowers and Morena Help Wanted ad in 1989, and then would never have been part of the heritage staff today. Is that destiny? Perhaps it is.
Maybe it's being in the right place at the right time.
Could be that as well.
Yeah. Well, finally, complete the wording of this bumper sticker on your car. I'd rather be...
Visiting my grandson.
And what is it about your grandson that delights you so?
Well, my grandson is 6 months old. And he was born in the Dallas area, actually up in Allen, where I live. My daughter and son-in-law were living locally in the community called The Colony, Texas. But they came over to the Allen Birthing Center, and she gave birth to my first grandchild, my grandson Gavin. And shortly afterwards, my son-in-law was transferred to Chicago. So they now live just across the border in Kenosha, Wisconsin. So I don't see my grandson at all to speak of. Well, not like I did when he was first born. My wife and I would be pretty much there constantly. And now they're in Wisconsin, and we don't get to see them like we would like to. So I would certainly rather be visiting my grandson.
I can understand. Well, Mark, thank you. And we'd like to open up the floor to some questions from the audience. Do we have some questions?
Mark, since you're a bowler, do you think that the 300 game is about the same as a hole-in-one? It seems like it might be.
I don't think so, Steve. A hole-in-one is one lucky shot. A 300 game is 12 really good shots. So I think a 300 game is much more difficult than a hole-in-one.
Well, some of us who have never gotten a hole-in-one or a 300 game, it really isn't material. However, you do know that your wife and I are related.
They are. You are.
Yes.
My wife's grandmother's maiden name was Ellsworth. And so my wife and Colonel Steve Ellsworth are distant cousins. We haven't figured out quite how distant yet.
Well, that's because some of them were hung as horse thieves.
Yes, do we have another question?
I'd like you to touch a little bit on some of your favorite catalogs you worked on.
My favorite catalogs.
Favorite
Goodness.
auction catalogs. I know the Who's Sick is my favorite, as you know.
My favorite auction catalogs, well, let's see. When I was at Bowers and Morena, I joined just after they had concluded all of the Norweb sales, so I was not involved in that. So my first big collection and catalog that I was a big part of were the 1996 and 97 Eliasberg catalogs. And I'm certainly very proud of those. That was my first big collection. Then 1999 and 2000, handling the Bass collection was an amazing experience. And there were some other collections at Bowers and Morena that were certainly memorable, but probably the catalogs with Heritage, 2005, the Gold Rush catalog, the Gold Rush collection was quite a special collection. The Hughes collection catalog that you mentioned, that was very special. I would say that's one of my favorites as well. The Ed Price catalog of early dimes was a special catalog. But you know, my colleagues here, we have all worked together on a number of really special catalogs. The series of Newman catalogs, for example, I think have been second to none. And my co-catalogers and myself, I think we make a pretty good team.
I'd agree.
Another question for Mark.
Do you actively collect, and if so, what areas?
Well, I have my hometown numismatic collection, which is expanded to hometown history. That's a collecting interest. Obviously, we talked about the postcards, and then there's my numismatic library, my personal library. See, I moved it twice in a year. Once in 2003 from New Hampshire to Louisiana, and again in 2004 from Louisiana to Dallas. So I can tell you that my personal numismatic library fills 160 boxes. My wife has, on more than one occasion, told me not to bring in any more books to the house, but I still do.
And we have time for one more question. Is there another? Well, thank you everyone for your questions. Finally, Mark Borckardt, in numismatics and in life, what would you like your legacy to be?
My legacy. That's a tough question to answer, I think. But I guess I would say I'd like my legacy to be world-class numismatist and all-around nice guy.
I think that's a wonderful goal to have. So in closing, I want to thank you, Mark. And before you share your Finley collection with your fellow collectors, I would like to invite A&A President Gary Adkins to come to the stage.
Mark, professional numismatist and all-around great guy, I'd like to present you with a presidential award for your contributions to numismatics.
Gary, that's so special. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And so congratulations, Mark. And we appreciate your boundless enthusiasm and your dedication to the hobby and for your longtime support of the American Numismatic Association. So please, everyone, come and visit with Mark and his collection. And I want to remind you that your tickets have space on the back for autographs. I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening. And we look forward to seeing you all in Philadelphia. Good night.